By comparison, the resistance offered by French colonial garrisons was light, and in many instances merely token. On the landing beaches, the greatest hazard was the unpredictable tide and surf and the inexperience of the boat handlers. Over the course of the day, more landing craft would be lost through accidents, broachings and collisions than to enemy fire. Off Casablanca, the naval duel continued for several hours, and it was here also that the Allies encountered determined fighting on the ground. North of the town, the beaches were stoutly defended, and French aircraft made several strafing runs, adding to the casualties and compounding the confusion of the beachheads. Allied carrier-borne aircraft joined those flown in from Gibraltar, gradually chasing the inferior French machines from the landing areas. By noon, most of the seaworthy French warships had been sunk or disabled, and the guns of the immobile Jean Bart had been put out of action by a well-aimed salvo from the American battleship Massachusetts. French aircraft still appeared intermittently in the area, but as yet, no task force vessel had sustained significant damage. Of the three French ports strategically targeted for early seizure, Algiers proved the easiest and was captured with its harbour facilities intact on the first day. The port of Oran, however, proved more difficult, partly due to the failure of two key components of the plan. The main Allied landings took place on the flanks, in comparatively quiet coastal sectors east and west of Oran. These were largely unopposed, and beachheads were soon established. But a raiding party, in two light vessels, was sent in to secure the town's harbour complex by a surprise frontal assault. These were engaged by shore batteries and by French warships in port, and both vessels were quickly destroyed. A further component of the plan called for the quick capture of two airfields, situated to the southeast of the town. These were to be taken by airborne forces flown from England, but the long distances involved, combined with bad weather and poor organisation, resulted in most of this force landing on the dry bed of a salt lake, too far from their objectives and too dispersed to have any effect. The southernmost airfield was eventually taken by flying columns arriving from the coast, and a few hours later, two squadrons of Spitfires were flown in from Gibraltar. On the following day, the northern airfield was captured by American armoured units pushing along the north edge of the Salt Lake, and by nightfall, Oran and its coastal defences were completely cut off. On the following morning, battleships and cruisers of the task force engaged the seaward defences, while the infantry and armour cut their way into Oran from the rear. The fighting lasted only a few hours, and by midday the town and its port were in Allied hands. That afternoon, the French North African commander, Admiral Darlan, ordered a general ceasefire, bringing the fighting in Morocco and Algeria to an end. For the Allied commanders, the main priority now was the occupation and consolidation of French Tunisia, and elements of General Anderson's First Army were sent eastwards by land and sea to seize the East Algerian ports of Bougie and Beaune. But But the battle for Tunisia was destined to be a long and bitterly fought contest. When reports of the Allied landings had first reached him, Hitler had ordered troops to be scraped together and sent by air transport to take control of the key Tunisian airfields and ports. The first German units arrived on the following day, along with some 40 German combat aircraft. Over the next few days, more would be flown in, and a powerful German bridgehead established in Tunisia. On the 11th, Bougie was taken without resistance, and British and American troops began disembarking. Later that day, however, German aircraft flying from Tunisia swooped down on the transports. The attacks persisted for 3 days, sinking several ships and damaging others, and destroying huge quantities of equipment and supplies. Beaune was taken on the 12th, again without resistance from the French, and forward elements of First Army were probing the Tunisian frontier. But on the same day, the first Axis naval transports arrived in the Tunisian port of Bizerta. Thousands of Germans were now pouring into the country, clearly intending to occupy it as a forward strategic base. By this time, Vichy France itself was under German occupation, and on the 13th, the French garrison forces in Morocco and Algeria were rearmed and placed under Allied command. The withdrawal of Rommel's Panzer Army from the Alamein positions had been undertaken only in the face of its imminent destruction and at the last possible moment. Inevitably, much had been abandoned, including a large part of the Italian infantry, through an acute shortage of transport. But the more mobile German divisions, although considerably depleted, had escaped with at least some of their equipment. From Alamein, these units fell back along the unbroken coastal highway to Fouca, some 50 miles to the west. British pursuit was initially hampered by traffic jams and by the inevitable logistical difficulties of processing large numbers of casualties and prisoners. Axis rear guards deployed on the desert flank compounded these problems, and German air units sought every opportunity to harass and disorganize the British. Clearing up and salvage occupied engineering units that might otherwise have been available for minefield clearance. These still presented problems, not only in the Alamein sector, which in some places was still heavily mined, but also at Fouca, where an old, unmapped minefield held up the pursuit for several vital hours, enabling Rommel to pull back a further 50 miles to Mersa-Matruh. From Mersa-Matruh, rain and mud hampered any further attempts to cut off the retreating Panzer Army by outflanking movements through the desert, and efficient German demolition teams and rear guards hampered direct pursuit along the coast. On November the 10th, less than a week after the retreat began, the surviving elements of Rommel's army crossed over the Egyptian frontier to Libya. 2 weeks later, they reached the Mersa Brega positions, from where they had set out to conquer Egypt almost a year before. Meanwhile, at the other end of the continent, the follow-up convoys were unloading stores and equipment and disembarking fresh troops. Huge stockpiles were built up to sustain the Allied forces in their drive east. Airfields, roads, and supply depots had